welcome each other if you would.
No. The internet is out, and so I need to go to my office and get a copy of my PowerPoint to take to Daryl. And so Elaine is going to take your prayer concerns, and I'll be back in just a minute. So if you get through taking prayer concerns before I get back, just fellowship, and then I'll get us started. And we are we're starting off in verse 13 because last week's study actually went through verse 12 of chapter 47, and that was sort of a good breaking point in the chapter and in the story for the study. And so, what we'll look at tonight is we'll look at what happened during the last 5 years of the famine, and then fast forward a little bit from there because. Trying to keep us on track with the biblical timeline as we do each week. The events of chapter 47 from verse 13 on happens over a 17-year period. And the reality is that tonight's text begins in the second year of the famine because that's when all of this is happening with Joseph revealing himself to his brothers and his dad and his family moving to Egypt. And so this happens from the second year of the famine and goes for another 17 years. And so this would put this part of the story, as you see there on the screen, between the years roughly 1656 and 1639 BC. And so as we get started tonight, as I said, we're going to pick up in verse 13 and look at verses 13 and 14 and see how Joseph was trading grain for silver, or maybe a better way of looking at that is the people were trading silver for grain. So look at verse 13 with me. It says, "But there was no food in the entire region, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan were exhausted by the famine. Joseph collected all the silver to be found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan in exchange for the grain they were purchasing, and he brought the silver to Pharaoh's palace." So after Pharaoh's meeting with Jacob and 5 of Joseph's brothers, we find that his brothers get settled in the land of Canaan, or actually in the land of Goshen, and then verse 13 starts off with a contrast between the success of Jacob's family in the land of Goshen and the effects of the famine on everyone else in Egypt when it says, "But there was no food in the entire region." And so we see that, that there's this this blessing that is occurring over the household or the nation, the soon-to-be nation of Israel. And everywhere else in Egypt, everywhere else in the land, there's no food because of this famine. We have some droughts from time to time, and if you raise livestock, you pay very close attention to the rain because rain affects the grass in the pastures. It also affects the hay that you're hoping to store for the winter. And so, we've had some I would say bad droughts, some droughts from time to time. But we've not really witnessed in at least the last 100 years here in the U.S. anything to mimic what they're dealing with here, because this is years of sustained drought and famine. Maybe the closest thing that we could probably relate to in the U.S. is maybe the Dust Bowl of the Great Depression era, that sort of thing. But nevertheless, there's just no food to be found other than in Egypt, all because of God's dreams that he gave to Pharaoh, Joseph's interpretation, and then the planning that went into effect there. And so this famine was so severe, that there just wasn't any food, but it was across, northern Africa, part of the Middle East, specifically the Palestinian region of Canaan and stuff, and even other Mediterranean regions. There's scientific evidence for a mass famine that affected this area of the world. But the lands in both Egypt and Canaan were not producing food during the famine. There was just really nothing to do. The land was exhausted, as the text says. But people paid for the grain with silver that they had. And so all the silver in Egypt and Canaan was exchanged to purchase what grain there was in Egypt. And so the people were coming in with whatever silver they had on hand, and they were using that to buy grain. Imagine that, you cleaned out your bank account and all you had was cash on hand, and you took every bit of the cash you had to go and buy food for your family, and that was your only option because, the economy, the famine, everything was that bad. And that's what the people in Egypt and Canaan were doing. They were basically emptying their piggy banks and going and buying food. And when there was no more silver to be exchanged, Joseph brought all of that silver to Pharaoh. So when the people's pockets were empty of all of their cash, so to speak, he took the cash or the silver and gave it to Pharaoh. Now, we see in verses 15 through 17 how the people were trading livestock for grain, or Joseph was trading grain for livestock. Look at 15 through 17. It says, when the silver from the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan was gone, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, give us food. Why should we die here in front of you? The silver is gone. But Joseph said, give me your livestock. Since the silver is gone, I will give you food in exchange for your livestock. So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for the horses, the flocks of sheep, the herds of cattle, and the donkeys. That year he provided them with food in exchange for all their livestock. So once, the people's bank accounts were basically emptied of silver, there was nothing left for them to use to, purchase the needed food or grain. And so the people confronted Joseph about needing grain. And so Joseph decided in that moment to barter with the people for the grain and buy what they need, work with them in that way. And so Joseph agreed to trade grain for the people's livestock. And so this was their opportunity to provide for their families. But it's kind of interesting because if you think about it, at least for the sheep and the cattle, that's a source of protein. That's at least food, even if it is on the hoof, so to speak. That's still food that they had available. But think about it, because of the famine, what could the livestock not do? They couldn't eat, right? So why let your livestock starve to death and you don't have the resources to provide food for them, yet Pharaoh has all of these storehouses and plenty of grain at his disposal so he could maintain the herds and the livestock. And so Joseph agreed to make the trade with the people. And so people traded horses and sheep and cattle and donkeys for grain. If it had 4 legs and they couldn't feed it, they were trading it for grain. And so that was really what they were trying to do. And this, because of the way that the scripture reads, this was probably during the 3rd year of the famine. It might be closer to the 4th year, but it's definitely the 3rd to the 4th year of the famine. But then we go on into verses 18 through 22, and we see that people are still needing grain. And so what Joseph starts trading them for is land and their labor. Look at verses 18 through 22. When that year was over, they came the next year and said to him, we cannot hide from our Lord that the silver is gone and that all our livestock belongs to our Lord. There is nothing left for our Lord except our bodies and our land. Why should we die here in front of you, both us and our land? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. Then we with our land will become Pharaoh's slaves. Give us seed so that we can live and not die, and so that the land won't become desolate. In this way, Joseph acquired all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh, because every Egyptian sold his field since the famine was so severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's, and Joseph made the people servants from one end of Egypt to the other. The only land he did not acquire belonged to the priest, for they had an allowance from Pharaoh. They ate from their allowance that Pharaoh gave them, therefore they did not sell their land. So once the silver's gone, and now once their livestock have all been traded, and that there's no livestock any longer available in the land of Egypt to be traded for grain, the people confronted Joseph again about needing grain. This is literally life or death for these people, because if Joseph took a difficult stance with them, people would die. And so the people offered up their land and their bodies, their labor, for grain, saying, buy us and our land in exchange for food. Then we with our land will become Pharaoh's slaves. Give us seed so that we can live and not die, and so that the land won't become desolate. And so, the people are just trying to survive. Plus, they're trying, remember, we talked last time about how they were masters of crop agriculture and not so much livestock agriculture. And so, for them, they had a real connection with the land and a real desire for the land to be useful down the road. They didn't want it to just grow up in weeds and not be useful at all. And so Joseph agreed again to barter with them, with the people for the grain. And what we see is that he traded grain for the people's land. And then he basically made them sharecroppers for Pharaoh. Basically the definition of a sharecropper is somebody who's given, the seed. They rent the land through their labor. They keep a little bit of the seed for themselves, or the harvest for themselves, but give the rest to the owner of the land. And the offer the deal that we're going to see in the next section of text that Joseph gave them was a pretty sweet deal for them, because he could have turned it around the other way. Then instead of giving them a really good contract, I guess you would say, with with Pharaoh. So the folks have given all their silver, all their livestock, all of their land. Now they've become Pharaoh's servants, slaves, sharecroppers, however you want to phrase it. They're just they've exhausted every option that they had to be able to put food on the table. And so this would have probably been in the 4th year of the famine. There's 7 years, so this is sort of the halfway point. It may again be towards the end of the 4th into the 5th year, but most likely it was during the 4th year of the famine. So look on into verses 23 through 26, and we're going to see that the people are again not so much bartering, but Joseph is negotiating from a position of power. Let's just put it that way. And the people have to agree to get grain in the future. They have to give up their future harvest. So look at verses 23 through 26. It says, Joseph said to the people, "Understand today that I have acquired you and your land for Pharaoh. Here is seed for you. Sow it in the land. At harvest you are to give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. 4/5 will be yours as seed for you the field, and as food for yourselves, your households, and your dependents." "You have saved our lives," they said. "We have found favor with our Lord and will be Pharaoh's slaves." So Joseph made it a law still in effect today in the land of Egypt that 1/5 of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. Only the priest's land does not belong to Pharaoh. So Joseph, really did start negotiating from a position of strength with the Egyptian people with how they were going to go forward, because he could have traded them just for seed for their land and the work that they were going to do that year, but he very wisely put in effect this rule for sharecropping into the future, if you want to look at it that way. And so he agreed to provide the people with seed for them to use. And then Joseph tells them, hey, this is how you have to, here's how you need to use your seed. This is the agreement that we're going to make. And so the people would harvest the crops, and Pharaoh would get 20% of the harvest. So that's the first part. Out of everything that they do, Pharaoh gets 20% of the harvest after they plant their seeds and do all of that. But the other 80% would be used by the Egyptians for the next year's planting season, as well as food for their family. Now, had Joseph been really a more difficult negotiator with them, he could have flipped that on them and said, Pharaoh gets 80% and you got to deal with the other 20%. But you see that Joseph is doing the godly thing here and trying to minister to the people, but also trying to provide for them and their dependents, and trying to make it, a good deal all around, but also to be able to provide for those future harvests. And so, verse 26 tells us that Joseph made this 80-20 rule, if you want to call it that, this 80-20 rule, and that it was still in effect when Genesis was written. I mean, look at verse 26. It says, "So Joseph made it a law, still in effect today in the land of Egypt," that a fifth would go to Pharaoh, basically. And so here's the interesting thing. Genesis was written by Moses, and it would have been written somewhere during the 40 years of the wilderness experience of the Israelites. And this would have most likely been between 1446 and 1406 BC. So what that means is that Joseph's law, this 80-20 law, was still in effect 250 years after Joseph put it into effect with the people. And so it shows you that that Pharaoh maintained his control over the land, maintained his sharecropper, army, if you want to call it that. And so Pharaoh, as that title was passed down by the kings of Egypt, for years to come, at least for the next 250 years, it was still a rule that was in effect. And it shows you that Joseph put into effect a good rule that was good for the people and good for Pharaoh. And so that leads us to verses 27 through 31, where the people of Egypt are taken care of. They've got food. They're going to have food for the future. They have to provide, basically a little bit of their harvest to the Pharaoh. But now we see a transition in the text talking about Israel and Joseph. And so look at verses 27 through 31. It says, "Israel settled in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property in it and became fruitful and very numerous. Now Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years, and his lifespan was 147 years. When the time approached for him to die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, 'If I have found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise me that you will deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I rest with my ancestors, carry me away from Egypt and bury me in their burial place.' Joseph answered, 'I will do what you have asked.' And Jacob said, 'Swear to me.' So Joseph swore to him. Then Israel bowed in thanks at the head of his bed." So right here we're told that Jacob and his family settled in Goshen and that they even acquired property there. So we see that God is blessing Israel in a powerful way, that when everyone else in Egypt is basically being required to give up their land because they don't have food, Joseph is providing food for his family out of the storehouses of Egypt. And so what that means is that they don't have to trade their land. They can continue to raise their livestock. They can continue to hold on to their silver, and they can even purchase land that maybe Pharaoh wasn't able to acquire. Think about it. These people around Israel and his family, when times started getting hard, they could have very easily have traded their land for silver with Israel and their people, so their land would increase. When their silver was gone and they needed to trade for something, they could trade their land for livestock, and then they take the livestock down to Memphis and trade it for grain. And then ultimately the land holdings of Israel or the family of Israel begins to increase in there. They still are able to be productive with their livestock, because we're told that they became fruitful and very numerous. And so this shows us the very beginnings of the nation of Israel here, because we know that in the book of Exodus we find that they have grown to be a large nation, and that Egypt is worried about the size of their slave force. Now, the interesting thing is that I tell you that this is the beginning of the nation of Israel, but I want you to look back at verse 27 and notice how it describes them. It says Israel, and we would think that that's referring to Jacob, but it says Jacob, and so it says Israel settled in the land of Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired. So what that's referring to is the fact that here is the first reference to them basically being a nation. Even though it is a very small nation that wouldn't even, fit in Rhodes, barely, But the reality is that it is a very small nation, but they're being referred to in that way. And the reason we see that is because in the very next verse, in verse 28, it says, now Jacob lived in the land of Egypt, it says now Jacob lived. So it's distinguishing between Israel as a people group and Jacob as an individual. He's not referred to as Israel here as an individual. Israel is beginning to refer to them as a people group or as a nation. And so what we find is that this part of the text picks up 12 years after the famine. Jacob is 147 years old, and he's lived in Egypt for 17 years now. And so there must have been this marked difference in Jacob's health, and he realized, or maybe the family realized, that he was close to the end of his life. And we're familiar with this sort of thing, especially when someone's been sick for a long time. We understand how people can take a turn, and there must have been a very marked difference in his physical health. And so what he does is he calls for Joseph to come to where he lives in Goshen. And so Joseph has to travel from Memphis up to Goshen and visits him. And Joseph at this time is 56 years old. So Joseph is 56, and he was the one son that had proven himself to be trustworthy to Jacob over all of his life. And Jacob never doubted anything that Joseph did, never doubted anything that Joseph said. Yes, he did show that favoritism to Joseph, but Joseph has proven himself, even from a teenager, to be trustworthy and honest, and that his dealings would be fair. And so Jacob relies on that. He leans on that. And so Jacob knew that not only was Joseph trustworthy, but Joseph would also have the means to help God's promise of Jacob being buried in Canaan to become a reality. And so Joseph, being as wealthy as he was, would be able to have that the ability to do that. And with the resources of Pharaoh at hand, there would never be a question of it. And so Jacob says to him, he says, if I have found favor with you, put your hand under my thigh and promise me that you will deal with me in kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt. When I rest with my ancestors, carry me away from Egypt and bury me in their burial place. And the burial place that he's speaking of there is the cave of the patriarchs. And it's the cave of Machpelah there near Hebron. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to his burial in the next couple chapters. But Jacob had Joseph to basically swear using a common form of commitment, and that was Joseph placing his hand under Jacob's thigh while agreeing to the request, while swearing to the request. And this is just like what we saw from Abraham with his servant Eliezer back in Genesis 24, when Abraham was sending his head servant to go and find a bride for Isaac back in Haran out of Abraham's family. And he goes back and he finds Rebekah, and the rest is history. So Joseph agreeing to do what Jacob wanted was not good enough. And so he told him to swear. He had to swear to do exactly as his father had asked him to do, and that's what Joseph did. And so that's where we find ourselves at the end of the text for tonight. But as always, we're trying to look at these lessons that we can learn from the story. And in Genesis 47, what we learn is that God blesses those that bless Israel. And so that's something that we have heard before. That's something that we know from the biblical text. But in Genesis 12, verse 3, all the way back at the time of Abraham, we read God telling Abraham this. He says, I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples of on earth will be blessed through you. Then we fast forward into the time of the Israelites, and they're wandering in the wilderness. And in Numbers 24, verse 9, the Spirit of God spoke through Balaam, who was, for all intents and purposes, a false prophet, and said to the nation of Israel through Balaam, said, those who bless you will be blessed, and those who curse you will be cursed. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. We're told from the time of Abraham, even to the point where they're almost at the promised land, that there is this blessing and cursing that goes along with Israel, that if people and nations, if they bless Israel, they're going to be blessed. They're going to receive God's blessing. But if they curse or injure or harm Israel, then they will receive those kinds of curses and injuries and harms. So the interesting thing is that what we see here in verses 13 through 26 tonight is the reality of this promise. And the interesting thing is we see the reality of this promise made 200 years before Joseph and Jacob are in Egypt. And then we see it 200 years into the future when the Israelites are in their wilderness wanderings. And we see that this promise is being fulfilled across the spectrum. Now, when Joseph's family arrived in Egypt, think about this. There were a couple of things that could have happened to them. First off, they could have been sold into slavery by Pharaoh. Pharaoh didn't have to honor anything with Joseph, and could have very easily have sold them, made them be slaves. He could have also told them, go and find land in Egypt. Go find land for sale. Go use your resources and buy land and do all those things. Find available pasture land, basically, rather than giving them the land of Goshen. Or they could have been refused by Pharaoh and the Egyptians and told, don't even come into Egypt. We're on hard times ourselves. The famine is bad enough for us. We don't need you coming into our country right now. We need you just to stay in Canaan. And they could have been forced to go back to Canaan and would have most likely have died during the famine because it was that difficult. But instead, what we see is that Israel as a person and Israel as an extended family and beginnings of a nation, that Israel was blessed by Pharaoh because he sent wagons to bring them to Egypt. He gave them their pick of the best land in Egypt, in the land of Goshen. He gave them their pick of the best products of Egypt, or in Egypt, and he allowed Joseph to give them plenty of food during the famine. And we can probably bank on the fact that they didn't have to pay for their food. It was an allotment that was given to Joseph, and Joseph was able to share it with his family. But here's the thing. Pharaoh's blessings toward Israel during this time resulted in God blessing Pharaoh during the famine. Because think about it. Pharaoh was blessed by God when he received all the silver in Egypt and the land of Canaan, as well as all the livestock, as well as all the land, and as all the people to be his sharecroppers there in Egypt. And God blessed Pharaoh because he blessed Israel. And so we see the exact opposite, though, in Moses' day with that particular Pharaoh, because that particular Pharaoh had abused Israel by making them to be slaves and to help build the monuments and making bricks and do all that stuff that they were doing during their time in slavery. And so that particular Pharaoh was cursing Israel during this time, and God brought down destruction and punishment on them in a couple of ways. Not only did they lose their slaves when Israel went into the Exodus, but Egypt suffered catastrophic losses during the 10 plagues. And so we see this on a grand scale between these two different pharaohs, that for the one that blessed Israel, God blessed him, and for the one that cursed Israel, he was cursed, and so was the people. Now, what we learn from tonight's text is that God blesses those who bless Israel. I mean, this is sort of an example of what we read in Genesis chapter 12 and in Numbers 24. But we see it being lived out in this moment and into the Exodus with the plagues. But we've seen, many of us have seen this even in our own lifetime when different parties control the government in our country. And if the U.S. is a country that is blessing Israel and supportive of Israel and has Israel's back, then God blesses our country. I mean, you can see it. It's just, it's very visible. But if the government or the particular parties that are in charge, if they decide to withhold help or I use the term curse Israel, but by being non-supportive of Israel, God is going to remove those. We see that God removes those blessings from our country during those times. So how do we apply this to our lives when none of us are in control of our government or the policies that our government makes? Well, what it means for us is that we need to be supportive of Israel and bless them in whatever way we can. One of those ways is through prayer. We can definitely be in prayer for the nation of Israel, and that's something that God hears, and that is something that God will use. But the other thing, too, is that we can use our vote to help make sure that we elect officials who are pro-Israel and supportive of Israel. And we see from a biblical perspective that that's what we should do. Because if God is going to bless those who bless Israel, then we need to be supportive in that way. So whatever we do, if it supports and blesses Israel, then we can be guaranteed that God will bless us in return. And so, we see it lived out in the life of this Pharaoh, and we see the vice versa lived out in the life of the Pharaoh during the Exodus. And so it's always wise to support or be a blessing to Israel. So that is our study for tonight. Are there any questions or comments or disagreements? None? Okay, I just want to thank you for not asking about what's the symbolism or what does it mean for Joseph to have to stick his hand under his dad's thigh, and what's that promise mean and everything. Because I read that this week and my face would be a whole lot redder than it is right now if I had to explain about how the reality of that is it was a Middle Eastern cultural thing that by placing your hand under the thigh, you are placing your hand close to the male genitalia, and that is a belief that was you swearing upon that person's power, and that's why Eliezer did that with Abraham, and that's why Joseph had to do that with Jacob. And so my face didn't get near as red as I thought it would teaching that, but I know that somebody, Dean Evans, would ask, hey, what's that mean? Why does he do that? And so Hannah's back there saying he was going to ask. He was going to ask. But anyway, that's the only times that we actually see that in Scripture. But that's what it was. It was a Middle Eastern cultural thing. So with no other questions or comments, then we'll wrap it up for tonight. And again, with Wednesday night being a possible snow event, if we'll share online and if we can through the phone tree about services. If we're not going to have it, if you don't hear anything, then chances are we're having service. So we'll plan to do that. If we cannot have services, this Wednesday night is supposed to be missions night. If we cannot have missions night this week, we will move it to the next week. And what I'll do is I will teach the Bible study that I was going to teach next Wednesday night. I will teach it on YouTube. I'll upload a video with that Bible study from 2 Thessalonians chapter 3. And that'll be our last study in the book of Thessalonians, or in 2 Thessalonians. So we'll just sort of trade 1 week for the other there. And then next Sunday morning, we will be continuing in our new series on generous faith and on giving. So with that being shared, I'm going to ask Terry, if he would, to close us with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.